Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to give my top 10 reads of 2019. According to Goodreads, I read well over 100 books this year, so narrowing this list down to 10 books was really hard. So I figure it's only fair to give some honorable mentions. I won't be talking in depth about these books, but the honorable mentions I have here that didn't quite make my list would include Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, The Pisces by Melissa Broder, The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, Where Reasons End by Jin Lee, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoyevsky, The Stone Diaries by Carol Shields, There But For The by Ali Smith, and Know My Name by Chanel Miller. So at number 10, I have My Antonia by Willa Cather. I'm actually really surprised that this ended up making my list only because I read it so recently, but with this book, the reason it's in my top 10 is because with how it describes scenery in particular, but also because of how these characters are confronted with themes of grief and death, specifically so early in their lives, I think is an interesting wheel or cycle back to how the characters in the book also describe the landscape. I'd say out of the list I have that this one is certainly the most about description that I enjoyed, the most probably out of the majority of this list. But yeah, I know that My Antonia is like a staple or a classic in American literature that people read in school, but this one really surprised me, and I'd like to continue with the other books in the series. At number 9, I have Early Work by Andrew Martin. I think it perfectly encapsulates sort of the sense of humor that I look for not only in real life, but also I think by pulling that humor off in real life into fiction is really hard. But yeah, I think Andrew Martin is like an underrated gem with the way he writes dialogue is very rich and believable. The book almost practically reads like a screenplay begging to be turned into a movie. So it reminds me of like a mix between maybe Sally Rooney and also Noah Baumbach, the filmmaker, if anyone's familiar with him. But with Early Work, I think as a story too, I like how it sort of, for me, flips on its head and you think it's about our male narrator or the male perspective, but it's really, I think, him romanticizing sort of the female gaze or perspective of our other character in the book that I think who it's really all about. So, and it also totally makes fun of like MFA writing and like writers in general. So I really enjoyed Early Work. I'm really excited to read more of Andrew Martin's work in the future. At number 8, I have The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I read over the summer, I think, or maybe late spring. But this is a book I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, but I still really like it. I think it sort of impressed me less throughout the year, mainly because in the beginning of the book, which I think is the strongest, where it feels like reading short stories, I think Richard Powers does a great job at sort of visualizing how characters respond or react very strongly to their environment whenever confronted with very heightened emotions at one time. Towards the end of the book, it sort of patters out to where the characters end up feeling more like to me, sort of caricatures than actually fully fleshed characters, which I don't think is Powers' fault. I think it's more so of the structure of the story lending itself to those sort of traditional elements in storytelling or in fiction that I recognize whenever so many characters are involved, which is funny because it kind of leads to my next, one of my favorite books of the year, to number 7, which is Pachinko by Jin Lee. So with both Pachinko and The Overstory, they're both stories I really liked and put on my list because I like how they managed to tell a grand narrative with so many characters while retaining, to me, sort of the essence of fiction being able to suck you into a story while still remaining surprising. And when it comes to contemporary fiction, I think Pachinko is one of the best out there. I think it released a few years ago, but I only managed to get to it this year and I really enjoyed it. And it follows the entire generational span of this specific family. And while they're sort of conflicts and worries are a bit sort of fundamental or I think expected in maybe like, fiction plot lines, I think everything the characters felt and dreamed about and had ambitions about felt so real and almost somewhat dormant, which sort of eventually feels inevitable to be brought up again as you continue reading Pachinko, but I don't know. Something was really raw and real and true about this story that I really loved. And I really liked all the characters and reading about them. So Pachinko, I think, is one of the best sort of contemporary books out there. So definitely pick it up if you haven't read it yet. And number 6, I have Milkman by Anna Burns, which I talked pretty enthusiastically about over the summer when I first read it. And the reasons it's still on this list is because it still remains to be one of the most refreshing reads I had this year. And it's so remarkable to me how it manages to construct story and rewarding the reader as the reader progresses. To me, Milkman is all about what reading should be, and I think it should be an endearing reading experience while raising elements that feel contextual and important to possibly history, although not required, I think, in fiction, but where Milkman concerns the Troubles so heavily and references it a lot. I think it does a really great job, especially following our female protagonist who's unnamed and as she's being harassed. I think it's not only about womanhood and also the Troubles, but I think it's all about how we believe stories in general, regardless of what it's about. But sort of the enjoyment we have in indulging ourselves in wanting to learn through stories, which I think is different from just reading fiction, if that makes sense. For me, Milkman hits, it checks off all the boxes and it remains inventive and fun while still grabbing your attention. And number 5, I have Amongst Women by John McGahern. A very simple story, probably the simplest story of the list I have here. And it's, just a knockout little quiet of a book about this father and his children and how he kind of resents them. But there's a scene I think about all the time in this book where it's snowing, and I think the siblings are headed to this church, and the brother, I think he's watching his sisters go there, and it's just very calm. And it's like this sense of clarity, and he doesn't know how to explain it happening to him. And there's so many instances in my life where I felt like that moment, and how I sort of describe life or what I hope to encounter in life the same way. So it seems like it always comes in the most unexpected of places in this book, whether from Morin, who's the father in this book, or his children. I think from both of their perspectives about living together and what it means to have a family, I think is really amazing to read about. So yeah, Amongst Women is a little powerhouse of a gem of a book. So definitely pick it up. And number 4, I have Villette by Charlotte Bronte. And Villette, I would say, really between this or maybe even The Pisces by Melissa Broder, it's probably the most sense of voice in a character I got to have the pleasure of reading about this year. I think Villette, she's so real. Or it's not Lucy, sorry. Lucy, who's our main character in Villette, she's very real and she feels honest. And in the sincerity of her actions that feel a bit like how she reveals her insecurities, like freaking out about losing a letter or watching a concert in silence. I think she accidentally lets herself be vulnerable while trying to maintain some sort of privacy. And I think that relationship between privacy and vulnerability is always a fine line in fiction whenever we as readers get to often be inside of our protagonist's head. Where Lucy was trying so hard to keep us away by intentionally keeping things from us. It was such a joy to read about Lucy, and it was one of the most fun reading experiences I had this year. At number 3, I have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Certainly one of the best books I'm probably going to read in my life. I think there's so much to talk about, whether it be certain scenes, kind of like with Amongst Women that stood out to me, about how with life, how there are these confrontations that we can always try to anticipate but never know what to do in the moment. I think, especially when confronted with violence, specifically in this book, I think either between Andre, Nikolai, or Pierre, I think with the 3 of them specifically, I really paid attention to how their circumstances, while very different throughout the progression of the book, make them understand their own humility with their masculinity. But at the same time, with other characters like Natasha or even Sonia, I think while them attempting to live within their own expectations of their own femininity, I think it also makes them wonder what it means to even ultimately, between all these characters, what it means to be human and be in situations that none of them can really help or in situations none of them asked to be in. And between all of that, there's certainly some great humor in this book. But again, those standout scenes, I think of Andre lying on his back, looking at the sky, or I think of the sleigh ride in particular. And I've thought about this book in waves often throughout the year. And if you haven't read War and Peace, I think it's Tolstoy's like wonderful tribute to the world to have written something like that, and make it feel like it's an experience that you've had before without realizing it, even though it's so unique that I could never have the experience of being like in the war or anything, but it all feels familiar and it feels nostalgic and like they were moments I was bound to live or experience in life way ahead in the future down the line without me even knowing it. And number 2, I have Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. My crazy year of Jane Austen that I had where I just binge read all of her books. But yeah, Pride and Prejudice, I don't need to explain it to you. If you haven't read it, it's incredible. I love the back and forth between the characters, and I love how clever and smart Jane Austen is between this idea of being madly in love and whether or not how we're careful with that and how our love isn't always for granted, that people should, work for it in a way. And I feel like, with the characters here, it's timeless with that feeling of pining and longing. I think it's something, hopefully not all of us, have to feel pining or longing, because sometimes I think that's even a worse feeling than, whenever you do find someone that reciprocates you being in love or whatever. That feeling of in-between or uncertainty, I think, is what permeates this book, but it's also a way to feel like it's full of humor. And the second guessing and the doubt somehow becomes charming and really fun to read about. And yeah, I think it's so much fun too, because reading Pride and Prejudice, I think having read Persuasion, really made me appreciate Pride and Prejudice more. That feeling of maybe both sides of the coin, because I feel like they're such different works, but they're still fully about love and intention and choosing who we love. And I really love Jane Austen, so yes, and I love Pride and Prejudice. So I'm so glad I read it this year, and that's why it's definitely number 2 on my spot. And finally, the number 1 book that I read this year that it was bound to be number 1 ever since I read it is Middlemarch by George Eliot. And I've never read anything so true to life, I think, or something I think will manage to explain how I've ever always felt about language or the use of language when it comes to communicating with others, but having my own privacy with how I sort of dance around with my expectation of others, or what it means to only feel like a side character in my own life. And again, with the study of, provincial life with this book, and that's what it's about. I think George Eliot made this book with such love and care, and she crafted it as if it was going to be like, I always believe that writers should write what feels like it's going to be their most, defying or best work that they're ever going to do. And I think it never didn't occur to me that George Eliot wasn't trying to do that as she was writing this. Nothing feels accidental, although life often feels like an accident. I think the way this book is constructed and how it was, serialized, I think is really great. And I think it was very purposeful, and all the characters have such heart and meaning, and the characters existing in between each other and weaving in and out is a joy to read. And I reread Middlemarch like a few months ago, and it was even better the second time I read it. Read Middlemarch. I guarantee if you don't love it, you'll think something about it, but hopefully this convinces you. All right, and that's my top 10 of 2019. I also realized right before filming this that I'm very close to like 2,000 subscribers, which is pretty crazy. So thank you so much for sticking around, and thank you for always watching. Thank you for wanting to hear about me blabbing about books. But I hope all of you have a restful rest of 2019, and I hope 2020 brings you great things. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.